Thanks so much, Zoe. Thanks everyone for being here. It's an exciting morning, and as Zoe mentioned, I'm calling in from Seattle, Washington. So it's bright and early here. It's still dark. I'm a blind person. Thank you, Zoe, for talking about um, screen readers and chats and things like that. So I'm going to ask the panelists to introduce themselves very briefly, and I'll start by just giving you a headline and a fun fact. And I'll ask each panelist to give us a headline about how they're situated in DEI, and a fun fact. So I'm Dr. Kirk Adams. I'm the immediate past president and CEO of the American Foundation for the Blind, which is Helen Keller's organization. I now am a consultant working with companies to help them supercharge their bottom line business results through disability inclusion. And my fun fact is our grandson Evan turns 2 on March 3rd, and his little brother or sister is due on March 4th. So that family lives a mile from us, and pride and joy being grandparents. Who knew how awesome it is? And so, Monica, could you give us a headline and a fun fact?
Sure thing. Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, depending on where you are in the country or in the world. My name is Monica Diaz. If you hear an accent, it's because, yes, I am Latina. I am from Puerto Rico. What I do for DEI is I am a speaker, a consultant, and a career coach on diversity, equity, and inclusion. Part of what my headline is that I consider myself to be a builder of talent of positive impact. And I've done that for 33 and a half years in corporate America, in companies like Merck, Microsoft, ESPN, the Walt Disney Company, and some others. The work that I do right now, it's tremendously exciting because after 33 and a half years, I am doing now this on my own. So I became an entrepreneur. And that's very, very exciting. My fun fact it is, I am enjoying some peace and quiet in my home today, because after the longest holiday season in the world, which I enjoyed in Puerto Rico, which lasts probably around 45 days, I had some more family come and visit here in Florida. So, geez, they left yesterday. It was wonderful to have them, but now I'm enjoying the peace and quiet.
Excellent. And Greg, how about your headline and fun fact?
Good morning, everyone. My name is Greg DeShields. I'm the Executive Director of Tourism Diversity Matters. We are a national organization that addresses issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion in the tourism industry. But I'm actually here today representing the Independent Business Alliance. I am the current board chair, and I see Sydney out in the audience. So, hey, Sydney. The LGBTQ Chamber really has served as one of the organizations to really help implement opportunities for LGBTQ businesses to be successful and thrive in the city of Philadelphia. I am really fortunate to be a part of an organization that perhaps 20 years ago would have had a real tough time to be as impactful as it has been. I think one of the real fun facts that I'd like to share is that a few years ago, we launched our efforts around being much more diverse and inclusive. And through the National Gay and Lesbian Chamber of Commerce, that particular program did win Program of the Year. And I thought that was really a compliment to all the hard work that everyone does and still continues to do at the IBA. So thank you, and I'm glad to be here today.
Wonderful. And Diane.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Diane Hettinger. I actually have a healthcare background. I'm a registered nurse, have a master's in public health, but spent most of my career, in fact, pretty much all of it, in global corporate America, various jobs throughout the business, mostly in occupational environmental health and safety. However, also worked in sales, employee relations, and HR. And so I have a good sense of corporate America. And about 15 years ago, was asked to take on accommodations and accessibility at one of the large global firms that I worked at, and became passionate about this work. I am now consulting. I have my own company, Enabling Ability, as well as I work very, very much with Disability In, which is a nonprofit in the space of employment of people with disability. And so I work with companies to help them recruit, hire, employ, and advance individuals with disability and become successful in the workplace. A fun fact is that I climb mountains, and I've climbed 3 of the 7 summits. And my next one is Mount Kosciuszko in Australia in about 2 months from now.
Great panel. I climbed Mount Rainier, but it was a long, long time ago.
That's a great accomplishment.
Yeah, thank you. So let's jump right into it. You're gonna get what you came for today. So Greg, when we met to get to know one another a little bit, you brought up the elephant in the room. Supreme Court striking down affirmative action programs, state legislatures passing anti-DEI laws. Can you talk about where we're at with DEI and in this constant evolution of this space we're discussing today?
Well, you certainly used the most important word, and that is about the evolution of diversity, equity, and inclusion. I try to remind people that diversity, equity, and inclusion did not start in the summer of 2020. You know, if we look all the way back to the civil rights movement, and certainly how over the decades we continue to evolve how it's integrated, not just in our society, but in business as well. And that's really where we're at today. It is certainly complicated because of the political environment and the cultural environment that we have as a country. But, you know, looking back on previous years, we've had similar volatile periods. What is important, I think, at the end of the day, is that we remind everyone that diversity, equity, and inclusion, it's a business strategy. It is what allows for organizations to create an environment that are welcoming and inclusive. It also creates an environment that allows for the organization to be seen as an employer of choice. And it also allows employers to certainly be much more authentic in terms of their ability to meet the needs, or quite honestly, the expectations of customers today. Customers have certainly become much more educated, not just about products and services, but about the experience that they have and how comfortable and how welcome they feel. And the influence that they have in terms of contributing to the bottom line of organizations makes it a real priority. So how leaders do it has certainly changed. There was, without any doubt, opportunity to be quite public and very vocal about it during the summer of 2020, but it was always considered a business strategy that should be rooted in how the organization's DNA functions. And it does not necessarily need to be a big flag that they wave out front to say, hey, we're a diverse and inclusive organization. And for many, that's where they wound up getting that title of being very performative, you know, just really putting it out there to say that they're diverse and inclusive, when in fact it may not have been a long-term commitment. And that's what this work is. It's a long-time commitment. And for leaders who are in this particular space, they should certainly look at it as how they continue to evolve their business strategy. Some have stopped putting the public face of DEI and have really focused on how it's integrated within their business, how it's been adapted in terms of their hiring practice, their supplier practices. Certainly many more have become much more mindful of how accessible their work environment is and how they engage with very diverse communities. So I would say the key thing as we move forward is to take into account that it does continue to evolve. And as those who are in this space, here we may not call it DEI, we may wind up calling it something different, but it is the same work. Thank you. Great.
And Monica, when we were talking about these things, you asked a question, and I'll ask you to answer it. So you said, when we toss out DEI, what groups are we throwing out?
Yes, it's part of what is the challenge these days, right? To the Greg's point, this did not start on the summer of 2020. This work has been going on for a long, long time, and not only in the United States, but globally. And when we think about the groups that are typically not included or are tossed out when we criticize or politicize D&I, we want to be mindful of what are we talking about. No group should be thrown out, first and foremost, okay? But clearly, we want to make a distinction, particularly as we speak with the audience of that is here today, about the fact that when we think about human differences, we're talking about people of different race, gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender identity, veterans, people with disabilities, people who have a different national origin, who happen to have an accent like me. I don't know. I've been told. I really don't hear my accent, but I've been told. So I'm going to believe that I do have it. So we're talking about those differences. The differences that we can all be a part of at any point in time. People who happen to be at a heavier set, as they call it now. People who may be too tall or too short. Those are differences. People who have a different faith that they profess. So when we toss it out, we want to make sure that we understand, are we represented by one of the differences that diversity is really investing in? And then kind of figure out if we have a place or not. Because many people say, that's only about this particular group or the other. And that is not true. I like to ask people, when was the first time that you felt different? And 95% of the time, people can identify a time when they felt different. Well, that's what we're talking about. And if for that 5%, if you're thinking, okay, what about that 5% that you're not mentioning or cannot identify a time when they felt different? That's an interesting proposition for them to think, why am I in the minority? Why is it that I cannot think of a time in which I felt different? So that opens up an interesting conversation about understanding others who do feel different for one reason or another. So we also want to be mindful about that.
Monica, in the late 90s, when I was studying for my master's in not-for-profit leadership, I read a book called Beyond Race and Gender. And there was one example that has just stuck with me over the years. And it was an engineering company in Alabama. And they hired a new bright young engineer into the group. And the group became very dysfunctional. And it turns out that everyone else on the team had gone to Alabama. And this new person had gone to Auburn. And that was the root of the difference and the exclusion and the not inclusion and the feeling of not belonging. Along those lines, I have a visible disability. I walk in, I have a white cane in my hand. I have a Braille note taker. It's pretty obvious that I'm a blind person. A wheelchair user, guide dog partner, same. 70% of people with significant disabilities have invisible disabilities, and self-disclosure is such a thing, as those companies who are striving to be inclusive of people with disabilities are already employing many people with disabilities who have not received the support and accommodations they should have as employees. Could you talk a little bit about invisible versus visible and self-disclosure?
Was that for me, Kurt?
Yeah, Monica.
Oh, Monica.
Yeah.
I think, Diane, I think you wanted to speak about that on our earlier conversation. So please go ahead.
Sure.
Yes.
And Monica, feel free to jump in.
And Diane, if you could toss in accommodations and intersectionality, then we'd have a whole package.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Well, that's where I was actually going to start. And so one of the primary things I like to start with is that disability does not discriminate. And both Greg and Monica have talked about, some of the cultural things that businesses need to keep in mind. And one of them is that disability does span across all the other diversities that Monica was so good at speaking about. And 70% are invisible or not apparent, as we like to say. And so it's important to remember that you already, as a business person, you already have individuals in the workplace who are people with disabilities. And they may be struggling. They may not be disclosing that they have a disability, especially if it's not apparent. And it's what you need to do to work on that culture that Greg talked about is listen to them. And how companies do that is they start employee resource groups or networks of some sort to give their employees an opportunity to talk about who they are and what they need. And so those ERGs are very, very good at developing listening sessions so that they know what their employees need. Companies need to foster a framework of accessibility and ensure that buildings are not only accessible, but their digital landscape is accessible as well, that they're buying products and services through their supplier diversity groups that are accessible. And so, how do companies get there? And I think, Greg, you mentioned culture. How they get there is to raise awareness through education and begin to have training. And training can encompass all diversity, but it needs to remember that disability is extremely intersectional. It spans across all that diversity, and that when you raise awareness and speak about education in the workplace around differences of people that Monica mentioned, that disability is included, and that you speak about it and listen to what your employees have to say.
Hey, thanks. Thanks, Dan. So Greg, you talked about business strategy a little bit at the beginning. So as I think about these things, I think a lot of the backlash we're seeing now is some notion that DEI is providing favoritism for individuals, giving individuals unfair advantages, which I certainly would have a counter argument to that. But we're looking at this from an organization standpoint. Again, one of my professors somewhere said, whenever you see the word organization when you're reading business literature, replace it mentally with the word organism, because organizations are living, breathing, growing, changing structures. So could you expand a bit on your thinking about how, we'll just call it inclusion for now, how inclusion helps businesses become more effective in accomplishing their mission and delivering their value to society, to their customers, to the community, to the employees?
Sure. And I would start off by saying that this particular process in any organization begins with some sort of self-assessment. A number of leaders would like to dive into the work of DEI without necessarily even knowing where they are. And in most cases, there is a disconnect or gaps that exist in terms of perhaps what they'd like to be and what they are in reality. So getting a sense of where you are so that you know where you have to go certainly helps to build a strategy that's more successful. Many leaders would like to dive into some of the obvious interpretation of it in terms of talking about, unconscious bias and microaggression, and all of that certainly may be a part of it, but there could be an even more rooted systemic issue that is within the way that the organization focuses or even prioritizes DEI. So if the organization has a board, there should be an assessment done to the board to kind of find out where everybody is and where we have to move everybody to get them to the ideas or how we would like to prioritize it. And through that board role, if there's one that exists, that it helps to establish it as a part of a priority and the DNA of the organization. The business leader then has to determine, how will this apply to us being a successful organization? Is it more qualitative about us being known as an employer of choice because of the welcoming and the inclusive environment that we create, which allows for the best and the brightest of talent in order to join our organization so we can compete within a global business market? Or is it about, quite honestly, just establishing new business markets? And, in our tourism industry, we've certainly found that the growth of the able-disabled community has become quite a very a promising way of increasing occupancy, and certainly having a way to be much more focused on segments that perhaps have been diluted in other segments that can now essentially have a sense of what the revenue potential is off of it. So it can be heavily and very much focused on sales and how we establish new markets or grow markets or launch new products. All of that is really associated with a business strategy. But what I will say for leaders that launch into that, if it is a strategy, it should be like any strategy. It should be funded well. It should be supported in a way that it can be successful. And most importantly, it should be evaluated so that you can determine, how well is this going? Are we moving in a direction that perhaps is not necessarily yielding us results? And could we put more money in this as opposed to that to give us a better outcome? So it is about monitoring it and evaluating it to make sure that you're making the decisions. But it's a long-term commitment. So I would certainly caution leaders who would look at a 6-month window and say, well, we didn't see much turnaround from that. In long-term plans, I would say a 5-year plan should really be developed to give you the opportunity to launch, to really integrate or implement whatever your strategy is, to monitor it, and then, of course, to revise it and upgrade it as you go forward.
I would like to add to something that you just said, Greg, because I think that that self-assessment piece for the organization and for the leaders is absolutely key. And going into, the element that Diane also mentioned, which is the how do we educate ourselves? And some people see it as formal training, right? So how do we educate ourselves in formal training? And how do we educate ourselves to doing what we're all supposed to do, which is to be continuous learners, because this is a world of evolution, not only in organizations, either, like this is also in our personal lives and our competency to be able to succeed and thrive in the work environment and honestly in every aspect of our lives. So taking those elements of self-assessment, learning, training, I would just venture to say the self-assessment needs to start right now in a world that has become increasingly challenging for this kind of work. It's just to determine where are we? Where is our organization and where are we personally? And I've been tinkering with this thought with some of you and my colleagues to say, hey, we need to kind of figure out if we are leading the pack and saying we're going to be doing the work, as you said, Greg, even although we may not be touting it or shouting it from the treetops, if we're leading and we are committed to it, if we're lagging because we're so afraid that we don't even know where to start and we're afraid that we might get fired or that our company might be sued or that our CEO is going to be called out, or if we're going to be learning, from what's going on and figuring out our way to move forward, even though we might call it slightly different, we might work around it something different, but the commitment for those who are definitely committed to, there has to be an opportunity to learn and figure out how do we move this work forward. So again, that self-assessment of where we are at a point of contention and a point of challenge is what is really going to move this work forward.
Yeah, and I think Greg brought up a really good point about senior leadership, that it starts at the top. It's a long-term commitment, and senior leaders really need to be advocates and to start telling their story as well. There's senior leaders out there who have both apparent and non-apparent disabilities or any other kind of diversity. And so it's time that they stand up, tell their stories, and then, as Monica said, bring that education in. What we've found is that education in the corporate environment is so important because you're doing it together with your coworkers. You're sharing ideas. You're speaking about things you didn't know and things you did know. And then we find people bring that out into the community and start working in community groups for all kinds of diversity and differences in our lives. They take it forward. And once you develop that, the education impacts your culture. So once you change that culture so that people look around, they see others that have the same or maybe different differences, but also are different, and they feel more comfortable to speak about who they are and what they truly bring to the workplace. They find the environment much more supportive. And that leads to higher productivity and greater revenue. And there's been studies out there. Accenture's done a wonderful study that was just published at the end of 2023. They looked across many, many global companies, and about 30% of those companies had a really concerted effort that started at the top of senior leaders, senior management, to recruit and hire individuals with disability and make them successful and advance in the workplace. They found that those companies had 1.6 more revenue, 2.6 greater profits, and about 2 times of economic profits, and the 2.6 was net income, actually. So it's not just about the finances, but it's that greater productivity. And higher retention, less turnover. And then, of course, what Greg talked about is it impacts your market. If you have, 1.3 billion people in the world that are people with disabilities, both apparent and non-apparent, those individuals and their families and their friends buy things, and they can impact the marketplace to a great extent.
Diane, you read my notes. I said, Diane, talk about Accenture report. So you just did. So, Monica, I'd be really interested in hearing how your thinking, thoughts, perceptions, view of inclusion have changed as you've moved from the corporate space to the entrepreneurial space. How do things look different from where you're sitting now?
Well, you know what? Things look a little bit easier for me, I have to say, right now. Because when you are in a single company, as I was, and companies that were very committed to this work, I was Chief Diversity Officer for 3 of them. So really, I knew there was a commitment to have a structure, to have commitment, to have a strategy. But even in those companies that lead the way, there are times that become more challenging than not, because they're also Fortune 500 companies and high visibility that people want to look. What is it that the companies are doing? And that puts you in the spotlight many, many times. That is very challenging, right? And sometimes companies have to navigate those challenges about being visible, like how much are we going to say it out loud that we're doing this? How much metrics are we going to put out there, which the talent wants to see, but these days are not those days. Now there's a lot of criticism for almost anything that you say, the words that you use, the figures that you put out, the fact that you're measuring or not.
Mhm.
Things have changed tremendously over the past 2 years, if not say 3. And part of what it makes my life easier right now is the fact that I can navigate from one company to the next. If they're saying, well, we're going to put this project on hold right now, we're not sure we're going to form this council, we're not sure we're going to establish this policy, we're not sure if we're going to wait to put a new ERG together, I don't need to wait. I can go to other people, to other clients who are ready. So my life has become easier because I see the possibilities of moving this work forward in many different ways. So I have more than one lever, more than one company to keep moving this work forward. And the advantage that I find in doing this is that I'm not the only one. Many people who have worked on this field like I have for over 3 decades are now moving into that stage of our lives in which we are in legacy mode. We're giving it away. We're sharing what we know because we want to make sure that the work that we have devoted our lives to doesn't die on the shore. And it's not. But we also recognize that there's a gap in terms of the readiness of many people who were giving great jobs on DEI right after the George Floyd murder because so much was needed. So we had to mature those new leaders on DEI super, super quick. But they felt, and they tell me, in our forums of practitioners quite frequently, they can take advantage of how do you get from here to there? How do you mature an organization who has done this work for a longer time? So I find great value that people see the value on bringing people who have done this work and are not necessarily doing it in a single company right now. So that's my life these days. And maybe that's why I feel more hopeful that we can get this done and evolve, as Greg was saying, because I know that for every company that is challenged and feels that they want to lag at this time, there are many more who are learning and a few others that are definitely leading and will continue to lead.
Wonderful. It doesn't feel like 5:35 a.m. when I hear you talk. Very energizing. So my brief time with Beacon, I've learned there are so many different kinds of businesses represented, large, small, medium, people who do work in large corporations, solopreneurs, people who have practices of various professional services, etc. And what I'd like to ask each of the panelists before we go to Q&A is just how can people get started? A company, a small company, they're not going to perhaps be at the place where they will have a chief diversity officer. They may not have the budget structures that some of the larger companies that that we know are in the DEI space have. So how can people start from where they are? What are some practical things that people can do to move forward on the inclusion journey? And whoever wants to go first, I'll let you self-identify which order you all want to go in.
You know, this is Diane. I'm gonna jump in here because I heard of yesterday from someone I was talking with, it happened to be a client, but she had worked for a small company. So this will address the small company, and I've worked in large companies. I could talk about that as well, but I think I think you raise a really good point, Kurt. It's really more about how can we get started where you don't have the resources that the large companies have. And she worked in this small, it was a water company. It was in the UK. They provided a questionnaire to their employees yearly, annually. And it was an accessibility assessment questionnaire. And it asked them, do you have everything you need to do your job? You know, can you, and it spanned from, you know, facilities. Can you get in the building? Can you, you know, get to work? It could even include, you know, commuting capabilities. You know, a lot of companies provide services like from train stations and bus stations to their front door. So it included that, and included digital, the ability to use systems and software, accessible technology. You're using a screen reader, Kurt, and there's other assistive technology that individuals with disability need. Did they have that? It could be something like lighting, sound, air quality. Do you have the chair? Do you have the desk? You know, does your desk rise when you need it? Is your chair an ergonomic chair, and is it comfortable for whatever your bodily needs are? So I think it's listening and asking employees what they need, and then focusing on broadening access, both for your applicants, ask your applicants, do you need some kind of an adjustment to go through the application process, and you know, be a candidate for the job. And then of course, you know, carry that over throughout the life cycle to your employees, and help them advance through the workplace by giving employees exactly what they need to be successful in the workplace.
You know, Kirk, I would probably say that it's more about the culture that you create in your organization. And honestly, there are awards for small businesses and their efforts around DEI. To that degree, it's really looking at the values of your organization, even if you only have one employee, but building a culture that would evolve in your organization as your business grows, realizing that that really helps to create a more competitive advantage for you. You know, once again, in a very tight labor market, building a culture that is one that's inclusive and welcoming gives you the ability to attract talent that may compete with even larger organizations. And of course, it also, for an entrepreneur, creates the opportunity to build relationship with different customer bases that perhaps you hadn't really focused on. I think the idea of small, medium, and large is just based upon what can evolve in terms of the resources that are put into support that organization. But even the smallest of organizations can do amazing work when it comes to that. And to that degree, I would encourage leaders to think of it from that perspective.
Agree.
I would add one element here for people who are or are not practitioners of this craft, right? Of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And at this point right now, I think it's a matter of getting very curious and getting confident. Curious about what is it that is coming against DEI. And sometimes we just want to do like, I don't want to hear it, you know, the opposition and the challenge is like, and you know, like new decisions in the court, new states that are establishing laws that are against DEI. All of that is against what we do. But I think it's important to get curious about exactly what is the opposition to this work trying to stand on. What are the premises? Because, you know, Diane brought it, all the data. We have the data. I have not seen the data on the other side. I have not seen the data on those who oppose it. They are saying about their perceptions, about what they think DEI really stands for, and they use terrible words, but they have no data to back it up. So let's get curious about what are their premises, and let's get confident. After we listen, it always starts with listening. Let's get confident on what we do know and bring that information, because it starts right now with a challenge. We are challenged. And if you don't know where to start getting curious about, again, take any conversation, don't shy away from them. Don't shy away, but listen with respect and curiosity, so you're confident on where we are, where we stand, and the numbers that we have to back it up. This is not about starting another controversy. This is about practicing what we're preaching. This is about listening to different perspectives and understanding where they're coming from, because we have a lot of information that we can put in front of people to influence their thinking. And if you're not sure how to start that journey, because it sounds scary as it goes, I'm not trying to be self-promoting, but there's a reason for which I wrote a book on this topic, which was that I didn't want to rely on being on a specific forum to share tools and share ways in which people can do exactly what we're talking about here. And the book is called From Intent to Impact, the 5 Dualities of Diversity and Inclusion. So go, and if you want to find simple ways, behaviors that don't even require for you to have a strategy, those are enablers. Those are ways in which you can get it started. So.
Okay, Monica. How can people find your book? And I did hear one question in the chat, which was about the Accenture report that Diane referenced. So if you go to disabilityin.org, disabilityin.org, you'll find a link to the Accenture study on bottom line business results from disability inclusion.
Yeah.
So
well, you can find my book on Amazon, where most of the books are bought. And it's in paperback, hardcover, Audible, and ebook. So there's no excuse that, oh, I don't like paperback, or I prefer to let you, whatever way you want to consume content, it's there.
I'm going to Audible right now.
There you go.
Downloading it. So let's go to questions. We have so much wisdom and expertise with Diane and Greg and Monica. And Zoe had volunteered to call on people as you raise your hand, which is a construct that I'm not crazy about, but that's what Zoom provides us. So here we go.
And if anyone wants to go back to gallery view, that's just at the top right in your view area. See, Elizabeth has her hand raised. Elizabeth?
Sure. Good morning, everyone. I hope that you're all fine. I'm a member of the Beacon Group. And full disclosure, Monica Diaz is my hero, my shiro. Very, very proud to have had the opportunity to work under her leadership. So, gonna ask a tough one. I think that we need more people in this space, and I'd love to hear some of the views about how do we bring, Monica mentioned the data, what's the data supporting exclusion? What's the data supporting homogeneous teams outperforming diverse teams? Where are the people, where we need more leaders in this space who might be part of that? I put in parentheses majority group, straight, white, able-bodied males, probably around 40-ish. I think we need more leaders in this space, and I'd love to get some feedback going on how do we bring them to the table.
I'll share an anecdote, Elizabeth, and it's such a pleasure to hear you here. So I don't know if this gentleman was a leader or not, but it's just, I almost see that just take every opportunity that you have.
Trying to get yogurt, and I was working,
consultant and a speaker on DEI. The guy put a face that was not welcoming. That's not the place that he wanted to go. And he didn't let me finish my sentence. He said, like, well, then that's a problem right there, because equity means that blah, 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 and using all the things that are not what we do. So, and he happened to be, I don't know, he was definitely over 40. He was definitely white. He was definitely male. I don't know about his sexual orientation, but clearly he spoke as it was in a dominant class, right? Very authoritarian. And he said that he always carried a $100 bill for petty cash. And it's like, what? So go figure. He said all the reasons for which he didn't agree with the work that I was doing. It was the longest yogurt buying experience I've ever had because we had the conversation right then and there. I listened to what he had to say and I gave him a reason for thinking about it a little bit differently. So for me, it's about every interaction that you have, the planned ones and the ones that are not planned. It's an opportunity to take a person who has a different perspective and listening to what his opposition was, and then trying to give them a reason to consider an alternative.
Monica, you broke up for me a little bit. So I missed the
Oh, I'm
reason
sorry.
that you gave that person. Could you, if you said it, could you repeat? You said you gave them
Okay,
a reason to
let
think about
me,
things a little differently.
okay. What part should I repeat? I don't want to repeat for most of the people.
I would just say you just mentioned you gave him a reason to think about things differently. Could you
Yes.
talk about the reason you gave?
Yeah, I just said, like, have you considered, it so starts with a question. Have you considered this other option that equity is not, he said that equity was about taking something from somebody and giving it to somebody else. And so like, have you considered that there's a different experience to that? Because in my view, and I say like, and I work with companies like blah, 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 that's not what we do at all. And I've done this for 30 years and I never taken something from somebody and giving it to somebody else. Have you considered that? And he said, well, no. I said, well, I invite you to consider that there might be another way of thinking and acting that isn't experience, but it's the experience of other people.
Hmm.
And he said, like, and he shook my hand and said, like, I respect that. I didn't plan that conversation. I was just trying to get a yogurt.
You know, Elizabeth, the one thing that I would probably add to the conversation is that how we engage with leaders around the areas of diversity, equity, and inclusion have to continue to evolve. We have to have a greater sense of the audience. You know, when we walk in and have a conversation, do a fair amount of due diligence of who you're engaged with, whether it's a small, medium, and large group, and really begin to craft that conversation in a way that really is meaningful to them. And not necessarily holding on to perhaps some of the more broad or general discussions that we've had before. You know, I spoke with someone the other day about how perhaps she could expand her vocabulary when she talks about it. And she just had a hard time letting go of DEI or letting go of the word diversity or equity, because so for the last 3-4 years, it's been the way that she's been able to get her point across. But you know, that's really a difficult approach, especially as you think of how the language evolved from the civil rights movements to what became what we do today. So I think it's about understanding who the audience is and being much more focused on evolving your dialogue in order to connect to them. And I think that's where Monica said about listening. So understanding what they're saying and how you're able to engage with them and not try and go directly back to them and say something that you obviously know is not going to resonate with them.
Yeah, and I would just add that, Elizabeth, what we found, you know, you have a DEI middle manager somewhere who's trying to impact those senior leaders, trying to get those higher level folks engaged. And I think sometimes if you have an employee resource groups that's more a business resource group, and as Greg said, speaks to what's important to them, perhaps it's products and services that can broaden your markets by addressing, you know, some diverse work groups. And it's also the storytelling that goes on, you know, having individuals start telling their story, and at some point, hopefully it will make an impact on these higher level senior leaders to also begin to share their stories. And that's when you really start changing the culture and getting more advocacy and awareness, helping companies to set goals and keep those metrics around their diverse workplaces. It's such a broad approach, from bringing applicants in to impacting your products, but it takes a lot of time and hard work and diligence to crack that nut. I agree.
Sydney, would you like to intro IBA a little bit more and talk about the trans work that you're doing?
Yeah, thank you. Greg did a wonderful intro of the IBA, the Independence Business Alliance, earlier at the beginning of his session, but it doesn't look like Zach or Maggie are here. For those of you who don't know, Zach is our CEO and does this little talk a lot better than I do. But the Independence Business Alliance is the Greater Philadelphia region's LGBTQ+ Chamber of Commerce. So we cover 11 counties, 5 in Pennsylvania, 5 in New Jersey, and 1 in Delaware. And the IBA is the first ever Chamber of Commerce to launch a program focused on trans people and our economic needs. So that happened 5 or 6 years ago in a formal way, but it's one of those things that we're doing around DEI, inclusivity, thinking about how all of these things come together. So yeah, transwork.org. You can contact me and get involved with our program there. We have a job board for inclusive employers and upcoming events through the IBA as well. And yeah, we are an inclusive program in every way. We, care a lot about everything that's being talked about today. So thank you so much for, caring about all of these issues, everybody.
I don't have a question, but I do want to reaffirm, I think, Monica's and the panel's comments about just the ability to meet people where they are and tell stories, because I think having worked in both banking and insurance works, we're definitely of a white male dominated peer group. If you don't listen to where others are coming from, we can have the same kind of biases because they're not, if we don't kind of try and meet them where they are. And it's work. It's work because it's bringing people along and educating them and helping them to understand and us to understand which is why this is such an important thing, and just the acceptance and the accommodations, and whether someone is, you can tell what group they have a disability or a physical disability, or whether you can't tell what it is, whether it's an emotional, that's a whole nother area we didn't talk about from a mental health perspective as well, the accommodations and needs. It's a challenge, but it gets back to respecting on both sides and being able to have those dialogues and have those communications, and all of us move forward and educate ourselves and learn to be on the same team, in essence, that we're accepting and driving to maximize. And it's not exclusionary. I think that's the big thing. It's not a win-loss. Somebody wins and somebody loses. We all win in the end if we are inclusive and provide equity for everybody else in our community. So
this is Kirk. I'd be very curious. You talked about the white male dominated industries you've been involved in. Can you recall and give us the gist of a conversation or a storytelling experience you had that moved?
Yes, particularly all my mentors were white male. And actually, I always sought to have a woman mentor. So now I do a lot of mentoring of women. But they were white male. And what happened is the reason that they mentored me was because they had daughters who were experiencing things. When I was coming up, and I was 20 years, I was a VP at 34 and a large $1.5 billion organization. And they had daughters that were experiencing certain things. And so I was blessed with having those relationships, and it put it in a different perspective than the other people. And because of that, it just, the dialogue was different. because they could identify with me. And what I found is if I can do that, it's amazing. And I'm also a member of IBA. If you can have the conversation, particularly in get the conversation started, that how you can have build relationships with people that you never thought have somebody in their life, whether it's somebody that's disabled or somebody who is experiencing gender identity, or, and they will welcome someone listening to them and maybe helping them to understand things in their life that are beyond. And then automatically they become an advocate and be able to help embrace in other ways beyond their personal situation.
I just want to add to that and IBA and the opportunity to continue moving the work forward when we have many parts of the country that are not welcoming on the conversation anymore. I live in Florida. I am not from Florida, but I chose to move here because that was my last corporate gig. I used to work for Royal Caribbean, and that's how I met Greg in the tourism industry. And living in some of the places, states, so some groups that I belong to call them the embattled states, are passing legislation that is not welcoming or doesn't even allow the conversation about sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression. And it's hard to thrive when you feel that you're trying to survive. This is not the time to go back into our closets. This is not the time to go and allow people to think that because there's a new rule or regulation, we're going to go back and retrieve. Somebody cannot be conquered until they declare themselves conquered. And we have fought this for a long time. Some people ask me, how are you doing? How do you manage to be right in a state that is embattled on DEI, that is passing laws and regulations that don't even allow colleges and universities to be funded or to have a department on DEI, much less to say, hey, the word gay. And we might call it families protection. We might call it, you know the stories. But this is a time in which people are retrieving to have the conversations in the places where they know they can help advance the conversation to others. It's not going into a closet. It's just to making sure that we figure out who are the people, again, who are leading, lagging, or learning. It's my own way of figuring it out in my head. And keep moving the conversation. We may need a strategy, like it happens when you are, like in any other situation in life, when you need to have a different strategy to go about it. But we have been strategic so far. This is not the time to retrieve. We just need to figure out different ways in which we can have the conversation, when we have them, how we have them, with whom we have them.
Mm-hmm.
But this is how we thrive, not only survive in an embattled state. And we keep this work moving forward because we're not going backwards. That's just how I feel.
I wanted to share two quick stories. Also, as the facilitator, behind the facilitator, thank all the panelists and Kirk, especially because of when he had to get up to do this. Really appreciate it. I think there is so much power in stories. A number of people have made that comment. And after I finish my two quick stories, I'd love to have others, both panelists and attendees, if you have any stories, because it's great to talk about concepts. I think sometimes it becomes more meaningful when you have that story to add to it. When I was at Merck, a woman that was working for me said, hey, Merck is launching this new women's mentoring network. You should come to it. And I remember looking at it and said, well, I'm not a woman, so I don't know that fits. She said, oh, you should come. There are all sorts of men coming to it. It's all right. I'll go. So I walk into a room with about 40 people, one other man and me. And I looked at her. But I learned so much from that group. So yes, I do have two daughters. I think that's an element of it. But just being in a group where I was a clear minority and hearing all the perspectives, I just think it makes you more conscious of other people and of what they're thinking, not just gender, but any other category. So there was a richness because I was willing to go there. And I gained so much from it. It's actually probably what eventually brought me to know Monica and get very involved in the things I'm involved with in Merck. So it was a long path that led to work that I really care about. The other quick story is it's a true story about a company called Leads at Scale. And I think it was Greg that made the comment, but the question was, if you have a small company, what can you do? Leads at Scale was two people, was the owner and one person or actually it was the owner and two people. He had a person who was blind and a person who was sighted. And what they did was outbound sales development. They would represent employers, they'd call, try to bring business in. And he was doing very well. The business was growing quickly, and he decided, I need to hire more business developers. Got ready to put out a standard offer, and he said, the person who's blind is bringing in so much more business than the person who's sighted. I think I want to focus my business development people on people who are blind, and elected to do an entire sales force of people who were blind or visually impaired. Other members of his staff were sighted, but the blind there, it's a generalization, but there's a tendency, and I think this was broadly across DEI, there's a tendency to be more empathetic, sometimes because of what you go through in your own challenges, your own life. And if you're blind, you almost by force are going to listen better. People talk about superpowers and super hearing. I don't know that that's completely true, but you've lost one sense. You're relying on that other sense, and you're not going to be as easily distracted by visual distractions. So I just wanted to share those two. I'm sure there are others out there, and that's why I'd encourage you to do it. But when you hear those stories, it's not about a concept. It's not about a study. It's about real people and real change that occurs when you're willing to open your eyes and accept things that are different and move into what's not comfortable for most of us, which is being with people that aren't like us. It's harder, but it's far more enriching.
Yeah. I have a similar story, Ed, where we had in a large global firm, we had a manager who wanted to do exactly what the man who owned Leads did. And we partnered with an organization that actually brought to the workplace a group of people who were neurodiverse. So they could be autistic or have other sorts of neurodiversity. And they began training them in a call center. And what they found is that these individuals actually blew away the training program. Were learning what they didn't know what to do with them after a certain amount of time, because they had this set training program that went for a certain amount of weeks, and they were halfway through the training program and already knew everything that they needed to know to actually be fully trained. And what happened is it actually raised the productivity of all the other employees around. Everyone else felt, number one, they wanted to be just like these individuals as far as their ability. But number two, there was more camaraderie, more collaboration, and everyone worked together to be a better group overall. And that's where you get those increased profits and productivity that I talked about earlier.
And Diane, this is Kirk, and Ed, there's good science around that. I recommend a book called The Talent Code, and it just talks about how people develop strengths by overcoming challenges.
Yeah.
And living the lived experience of disability in a world that is not constructed to support you provides a lot of challenges. So I talk to employers and ask them what they're looking for in employees, and the lived experience of disability allows us to develop really unique strengths in the areas of resilience and grit and creative problem solving and ability to work in teams, organizational skills, communications, because those are the things we need to do to survive and even thrive. So you're spot on. You're both spot on. Thank you.
I want to mention something to reinforce what was being said in terms of how do we go and learn? How do we go and inquire? How do we go and immerse yourself in becoming the minority, right? in another group that is not the one that we feel comfortable in. Because even though we may be all for diversity and inclusion, let's face it, we may not feel comfortable with all differences. So let's be very, very honest with ourselves. We may not feel comfortable with people who are from a particular religion or people who are from a particular country. We all have biases. Otherwise, we won't be, we have talked about unconscious biases so many times. But I do believe that based on the experience that I've had in 7 different industries, the power of immersion, of putting yourself in the situation in which you are the minority with the intent to learn. And in my book, I made I told a story about, it's called From Party to Parade. And it was my own immersion on the LGBT community. And the reason for that is, although I was already practicing DEI, you know, I grew up in a society, in a community that was not welcoming of the LGBT community. And I was raised Catholic my whole career and my whole life. So this was certain things about the work that I do and my beliefs these days that were not consonant with my faith. And I had to wrestle with that. So the way of wrestling with that is like, I need to create my own conviction. Doesn't mean that I don't want to believe what I believe, but I'm going to, you know, challenge myself. I'm going to invite myself to have a different experience. And the Party to Parade story was about my experience going to, and I'm going to say it in this forum, going to a party, a retirement party in the Raven, a New Hope in Pennsylvania. And if you are from Pennsylvania, you may have visited New Hope and you may have heard about the Raven. It's an LGBTQ friendly bar. And this retirement party was at the Raven. Because I knew that the person who was retiring had not come out of the closet ever, but I knew she was a lesbian. And it was then and there at the Raven that for the first time, after being worked with this person for a long, long time, she introduced me to her partner. And I felt there was such a miss of the years working together. She didn't feel safe to introduce me to her partner. But I was now in her environment. I was at the Raven. I had taken myself out of the corporate environment and going to the gay bar. So she said, oh my gosh, it's safe. And she introduced me to her partner. But I had to go through the immersion to go there. And then from Party to Parade, because my own route of discovery took me to, you know, doing my first, you know, Pride Parade in New York City. From that party to the parade, I was being very public about how I thought and what I wanted to experience in the Pride Parade. So again, immersion is a powerful, powerful way in which we can self-assess, self-discover without any threat other than discovering something that we may have not thought we were open to.
You know, I'd like to share a quick story about what we did over at the IBA to really focus on increasing diversity of our organization. A lot of that was really centered upon not just our members, but also our board members. So we were fortunate to have an organization that was going to make a financial contribution that would support specific programming that would engage diverse communities. So the dollars that we had were spread across gaining engagement with the Hispanic community, the African-American community, and the Asian community. So we customized programs during Hispanic Heritage Month, during Black History Month, and Asian Heritage Month, which were all networking events that fell in line with the typical kind of networking connects events that we produce within the IBA. And there were some requirements in terms of the guest list that it had to have at least 25 names from people within that community. Not members, not existing members, all new people. And we constantly think back when we held our first event for the Hispanic community, and we had more Garcias and Rodriguez and Morales who were attending that event than we'd ever had. But that program proved to be a huge component, became a program called Intersections, which allowed for us to constantly engage with diverse communities. And it attracted them to us. And as Sydney knows, we recently had our holiday party. I think it was one of the most diverse events that we've ever had. that showed that ability to do the work, to really commit to it. And you're absolutely right, Monica. It is about immersion, but for us, it was about immerging other communities into our community, which was a fantastic way of ultimately building relationships. And that program was done a few years ago, but it continues to bear fruit to the organization today. There were other things that came out of that particular initiative that focused on our ability to bring more diverse board members to help provide more diverse interpretation of it. But it is about that commitment and emerging with different communities that allows you to build relationships and make this work really come to life.
You know, it's also the, Greg, now that you mentioned that, how can we activate this? Sometimes it is, and again, I'm just taking it that it's a scary world for DEI these days. I'm just starting with that premise. Many times it's just about the questions that we're asking. And we can do that at work, if it's our job to do it, or as leaders. If we're just leading an organization, a nonprofit, our own family, it's just to practice what we preach, of getting curious and understanding human differences, to really find the value on everyone, no matter who they are, right? Sometimes people with invisible disabilities are just saying, hey, I have an invisible disability, and we leave it at that. And, there's another story that I put in my book that says, like, I had to ask that question to somebody who said that they wanted to participate in a panel discussion of an ERG, and they wanted to talk about invisible disabilities. And I sat down with this person. I said, like, I respect that, but I want to understand, how should I address you as a panelist talking about invisible disabilities? I mean, I'm not trying to disclose if you're not comfortable, but help me understand, keywords, help me understand, what should I know? How should I address? How should I engage you? How should I include you? All those different ways of just saying, help me understand, help me learn. Because I didn't know how I was going to address that. If you have an invisible disability, I didn't know what question can I ask you as a moderator of a panel. But long story short, we went through a one-on-one preparation in which we had those conversations that you can have at any time, not shying away from it. Just saying, help me understand what that looks like for you, which interestingly enough led to mental health. But it was my journey of learning and this person's journey to feeling comfortable even talking about it, right? So again, I think there was learning on both sides, and that's the opportunity to practice what we preach. Let's not shy away from it. Let's not try to just kind of like understand that whatever you give me it is. Let's get curious. Let's get confident that we can learn.
Pat, did you want to ask your question?
Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Zoe. I actually don't have a question. I just wanted to do a plug for Beacon's Diversity and Inclusion Committee. We have an active committee. We are committed to increasing the diversity of our organizational membership. We have 3 pillars. We focus on programming, on membership, and on education. And we are looking for volunteers. So if anyone is interested in joining this committee and helping us move our objectives forward, we would love to have you. Just get in touch. And you can get in touch with Zoe or me. Zoe knows how to get in touch with me, and my co-leader, Pam Seplow. So thanks, Zoe. I just wanted to plug our committee.
Thanks, Pat. And Eleanor, you had your hand raised for a minute there. Do you have a question you wanted to ask? Anyone else too? You have a little bit of time for another question or two. I guess I'll ask a question, and if anyone else has one, feel free to raise your hand. So I think someone touched on it. I forget who it was, but needing to get more people. I think maybe it was Monica, getting more people into this space that maybe traditionally feel like they don't have a vested interest in it because they are not, from a diverse community, or they're in the majority, whatever they feel like. And I'm just curious if you have thoughts about how to, in any situation, I think there's people who may have the power to be allies or the power to kind of speak up and help others kind of pull them back up, pull them up the ladder with them. So maybe if you can speak to how to be an ally and how to bring people along that may just need a lift or a boost or support. Because I think that's something I notice with people in my generation, millennials, that, sometimes we're like, all right, we want this opportunity, but how do we access it when, maybe you feel like you're shut out for your age or for your gender or for your race, ethnicity, gender identity, any number of things.
So you're asking, just for my own purpose of clarification, so how do you lift an ally, or how do you incentivize people who may not be comfortable sharing, who they are, to step up? So what?
Well, I would guess it can go to anyone, but yeah, how are you an ally to elevate the voice of someone else, but maybe not to the point where you're sort of overshadowing them, but how do you sort of be that advocate in a way that gets them to the table, but then still lets them shine on their own, or because sometimes even if you're in a minority in one way, you may still be, they may be your direct report, and there's a way to elevate them, even if
Well,
yeah.
so I would probably say it's that difference between who's a mentor and who's a champion. I think what you're really talking about is that person who can be a champion for someone, whether they're there or not, and really helping to shine the light on them and to acknowledge them, even when they're in a group setting, to support what they do and kind of invite them to share their thoughts. I think it's about how you're able to help bring a voice to their voice, and how you're able to support them, sometimes directly or indirectly. And I think that's amongst the ways that people can get more engaged around allyship in a way that feels meaningful, because it doesn't always have to be a very public-facing way of doing it, but realizing that you can be a champion that can help individual causes and individuals go that much further.
Yeah, and I think it's that old phrase, communicate, but really to talk to people, listen, and ask questions, and so you have employees either on your team or someone who reports to you to actually have a conversation about and learn more about them as people. And then from those discussions, you can learn what their strengths are and where they really would be able to shine, where you can put them forward because they have, a special skill in a certain area that you didn't even know about because you just didn't ask the questions or listen. So I think it's getting, really getting to know people, to listen to who they are, to, in a large company, ERGs is a great best way to do that. And Ed touched on this, to go to different groups that you may not be a member of. But like you may not have that affiliation, but you can become a member and you can become an advocate and an ally through that way. But on a small, if it's a small organization where it's just someone who's on your team or working with you, to really have those conversations, to get to know people as people. We stress that a lot in disability awareness and education is, and in fact, I just heard a TED talk recently where a young adult who is a little person, people came up, he said people would approach him and say, what do I call you? And he said, call me Dominic, or that's my name, like just get to know me as the person I am. And so it's that people first approach, I think, that helps us then advocate and be an ally for others.
Thank you. And Cindy, did you want to ask a question or make a comment?
Yeah, I was just going to make a quick comment. Hi, Greg. He and I went to high school together. I like this statement, and I didn't write down who said it, but I think it's very important that when you approach someone, find out the moment that they felt different, because I'm sure across every spectrum, there was one key moment. I don't care if you're tall or short, your nose is too big, too small, or whatever, you felt different. And I think that's a way to unify people and to maybe help people to understand a little bit about diversity and inclusion. So I just wanted to comment on that fact because I think that's very important. And I'm going to use that in my workshops and my speeches. So if you hear it again, It came from me.
So, Cindy, if you're curious to know what you made here, because I've used that several times during the years, I could tell you stories of what you might hear, so you're prepared with your answer to when people tell you if they felt different, not felt different, what has been more of the trend that I found. So happy to connect and share with you the behind the scenes cheat sheet to that question.
Thank
Monica,
you.
could you give us an example? That's so interesting, and I'm curious and confident to ask you that question.
Couple of things I would say. When I started asking this question years ago, I was very surprised to find that there were people who said that they didn't feel different. They couldn't think about a time in which they felt different. That was surprising to me, because I was betting that probably everybody could identify one. And there were people who could rack their brains and they couldn't. So understanding why they couldn't created follow-up conversations that I had to be prepared for, which originally I wasn't, because there are people who honestly, they can't. And that disturbs them when if you're in a room and people raise their hands and they see that all of a sudden they are the ones in the minority, that's very disturbing for certain people, because they have not thought about that before, and that's disturbing. So I have to be prepared for that. The other thing that I found is that many times when people say, when was the first time that you felt different? Many people go to 3 stages in their lives. Either when they were super young in elementary school, and those are the deepest ones. You know, that's when I see them cry. I see them blush. So those early in life experiences seem to be the deepest and the strongest, because they carry those feelings their whole lives. The second time that when they typically say that they felt different is when they went to college. Some people live more in a homogeneous environment. And when they go to college, they figure out that the world that they thought existed around them, it's no longer the world that they are encountering. So the whole college experience was another season in life or cycle in life in which people find the awakening to that they are different in more than one way. And the third time, and I didn't create this, I just gathered it through asking the question, it was when they went to work. Some people actually felt different when they went to the workplace. That's later in life. And that's when they figured out that there were people from different religions or different countries or had different accents. I was amazed by hearing that certain people could describe, when I went into this company, when I went on a business trip, because they had lived in environments that were more homogeneous. So I figured out that there were different experiences, and it categorizes it very differently. If your experience of feeling different came early in life, when you went to college or when you went to your job.
Oh, I want to say we're coming to time. I want to say it's been a privilege and an honor to spend time with Greg and Diane and Monica and learn from them and learn from people in our audience. I want to acknowledge Ed Hinkler, a source for today's panel, and he is a tireless champion for disability inclusion. And Ed, I just want to thank you for reaching out and including me in this space. And so pleased that Beacon has a DEI committee that seems active and gaining momentum. And again, I appreciate everyone's time and attention. And I'm assuming everyone has an intention to help move inclusion forward. And I applaud and support you all in that. And thank you, Zoe, for moderating the Q&A. And I think with that,
Beacon is the premier executive networking organization serving the Mid-Atlantic region. To learn more, go to beaconforlife.org.